and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Helen Nesadure, and I will be moderating this evening's proceedings. I am delighted to welcome you to Monash University, Malaysia, and to the third lecture in our Sir John Monash Distinguished Public Lecture Series of 2017. This lecture series takes inspiration from Sir John Monash, who is considered to be one of Australia's finest citizens, a distinguished scholar and leader who sought to use his education and abilities for the benefit of the community. The Sir John Monash Distinguished Public Lecture Series allows Monash Malaysia an opportunity to engage with the community here in Malaysia and also in the region through the promotion of thought leadership on key strategic issues strategic to the development of this region in the 21st century. Now, the hallmark of this lecture series is its coverage of a variety of contemporary issues and interdisciplinary topics delivered by eminent public scholars, intellectual leaders, international leaders, policymakers, corporate leaders, and scholars, all distinguished in their respective fields and whose works have had significant impact globally. This evening, to deliver the third Sir John Monash Public Lecture, we are indeed honored to have someone who embodies all of these qualities, Professor Edmund Terence Gomez from the University of Malaya. Terence Gomez is Professor of Political Economy at the Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya. He is globally renowned for his work on politics, policies, and enterprise development, on which subject he has published extensively, writing not only for academia, but also more widely. This work has taken him all over the world, and he has held various academic appointments in the United States, in Britain, in Europe, Australia, and Japan. His work is also of deep public interest, reflected in his appointment as research coordinator at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development in Geneva. That his research has global significance and impact is also reflected in the prestigious grants that he has been awarded to conduct his research, also globally, grants from the Australian government, from the British Academy, the UK Economic and Social Research Council, from Japan, the Toyota, Sumitomo, and Sasakawa Foundations, and also the US-based Christensen Foundation, among many others. I've known Terence for about 16 years now, and what has struck me always about him is his unwavering commitment to research integrity, to following the evidence to wherever it takes him, even if it is to uncomfortable places. And it is this that makes him a standout scholar. His work on the evolving relationship between the state and business has not only advanced our understanding of Southeast Asian forms of capitalism and the field of comparative capitalism more generally, his research also has important policy implications and for how we judge both politics and business. I am delighted to now invite Professor Terence Gomez to deliver his lecture on the topic, The Government's Business, Politics, Policies, and the Corporate Sector in Malaysia.
Thank you, Helen, for those kind remarks. And I'd like to thank Monash University for inviting me to give this Sir John Monash lecture. It is indeed an honor for me to be here today. I'd like to say a few words before I start. The lecture today is based on a book that is going to be published. When I was invited in January to give this lecture, I chose this date because I thought the book we're going to publish would be out by now. Unfortunately, it will only be published at the end of the month. The title of this book is Minister of Finance Incorporated, Ownership and Control of Corporate Malaysia. Yes, I thought that will get a few sniggers. But let me tell you, Minister of Finance Incorporated is an actual company that exists in Malaysia. This book is about that company, which so few of us have heard about. The book, the flyers are outside on the table if you want to get it. It's being published in England at £80, but I'm happy to say that we are also publishing it locally at 45 ringgit. The topic I chose today was because this is a topic that we have to confront. We are confronted today with a serious crisis in this country involving the nexus between politics and business, or government and business. And the reason why we took on this book was because we felt that there was a need to get this book out, to explain how does this nexus between government and business works. In that regard, I'd also like to thank a few people who helped fund this, in particular the organization Ideas. Some of their members are here today. One Saiful, One Jan, Ira, Azrai, Trisha Yo. I mentioned these three names because when they came to me about this project, when I was talking to them about this project, very few people thought we could do it. They believed in us, gave us the funding to do it. Not many people wanted to fund such a project. And I'm extremely grateful to them for giving us the funding that we needed to get this project off the ground. It helped me hire a few research assistants, and these research students have now helped me put together these books. Some of them are here in the crowd today. They are co-authors to the book. I've placed them as co-authors simply because this book could not have been done within a year without their enormous contribution in terms of finding the data. Let me be very clear, this book is extremely empirically written. We decided to come out with this book because it provides for the first time in one place exactly how the government works in terms of its links between politics or government and business. I also chose this book to be published at this time because the elections are coming up. Yes, we may laugh, but unfortunately it's no laughing matter. Elections is a time when we can hold our politicians accountable. Elections is a time when we have to put it out there. The key issues that our politicians must account for. The key issues that our politicians must grapple with, and here I speak to also the opposition, because they too have to tackle these issues. How are we going to tackle this issue? The book provides clear evidence of the scale, the enormity of the problem. And so here, as I said, it is a complex matter. Today, what we're going to discuss is how the state intervenes in the economy and how the implications of this intervention. So let me start now. The topic, the government's business. The focus really, last year in July, I gave a preliminary lecture on our findings. At the time, the book was not yet out. It was just our preliminary findings. And that lecture, I set out the evidence that we had. So today, I'm not going to repeat much of that. I will, of course, draw on much of that empirical evidence, but I'm not going to repeat that lecture. What I'm going to do today is go more broadly. I want to talk about intervention, state intervention, and how state intervention can be a good thing, but how it can also be captured by elite forces and be abused in the process. So let me start first by explaining what is state intervention. In the literature, the defining moment really was the Second World War. After the Second World War, when Japan's economy was devastated, what arose from there was a nation, in spite of its devastation, that emerged within a period of about 20 years as the second largest economy in the world. What had happened in Japan was seen to be a miracle. How did Japan do it? And some scholars, in particular Chalmers Johnson, then went on to study the Japanese model, and he called it the developmental state. The developmental state is characterized by extreme state intervention in the economy. It also involves a cooperation between, as you can see here, state and business coming together. This is a cooperation between state and business with the aim to drive the rise of highly industrial companies in a market-driven economy. But the state had a role to play here. The government would steer important economic rents to relevant companies to allow these companies to become the primary engine of growth for the economy. But another dimension of the interventionist state was you needed to have an extremely competent bureaucracy. The bureaucracy had to comprise people who were of the highest caliber. It's your bureaucrats who come out with your public policies. It's your bureaucrats who think out the ideas from the politicians, take them to the drawing board, and it's the bureaucrats who then also have to go on and implement these policies. If our bureaucrats are not of the highest quality, then the model will suffer. I'm raising these points because you can already see the direction in which I'm going to with this. The fact of the matter is the model worked. Japan, as I said, industrialized very quickly. The next country to do so was Korea. Park Chung-hee does a coup in Japan, comes to power, and very soon Park leads Japan into this newly industrialized economy, one of the great economies of the world today. The other country, the second tier, newly industrialized countries, was Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek gets kicked out of China by Mao Zedong, comes to Taiwan, takes over Taiwan, and creates this model of development, primarily driven by small and medium-scale enterprises, unlike Korea, which was driven by the chaebols. And then we have the third tier, countries such as Indonesia, Sukarno being ousted by Suharto in the 1965 coup. And Suharto does something which, for all the problems that he caused, also helped industrialize Indonesia, Thailand, the military coups, and also rapidly industrializing thereafter. And of course, Malaysia. The 1969 crisis, the change, and then we have a highly industrialized economy. The core focus today that I'm going to look at when I look at these countries is this nature of the state intervention. But my focus will be on Malaysia. My focus will be primarily on the two things that I discussed here: state-business nexus and government intervention. How does it work? How does the bureaucracy help in this process? How do government-linked companies work? Now, before I get into that, the first thing we must know also about these countries is this. When we talk about state intervention and the nature of state intervention, much of it was driven by the politics of the country. The politics of the state defined the way in which the state-business nexuses worked in these different countries. So in Japan, we have a democratic country, extremely inclusive. A social compact was created in Japan involving state, business, and labor. The social compact helped drive that growth. And in this model, there was no fear of business. And they created a model called the Keiretsu model, an interlocking relationship between banks and industrial companies and SMEs, all interlocked. Extremely vibrant, which contributed to this growth. Then we have Korea. Korea's model was driven by Park Chung-hee, as I said. Park Chung-hee comes to power, and Park Chung-hee decides to follow the Japanese model, the former colonial power. And Park Chung-hee also then brings on these big businesses. He tells them, I'm going to give you all these rents, I will give you the funding from the banks, and you can now, you have the entrepreneurial capacity, you can now develop these great enterprises. And they did it, the chaebols. Park, being a military general, had no fear of big business. And then we have Taiwan. Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, as I said, removed from China, comes to Taiwan. He's an outsider, he's a mainlander. He's not a Taiwanese. And here he's fearful of big businesses. He has his land reforms, and then he promotes the rise of small and medium-scale enterprises. And then we have Singapore. Singapore, PAP comes to power, having fought a battle with Barisan Socialists, a battle it barely won. Fearful of big businesses because they were so supportive of Barisan Socialists, PAP then culls these big businesses and promotes the rise of GLCs. Hardly democratic, authoritarian state, but they tend to refer to themselves as an Asian democracy. And then, of course, we have Malaysia. Malaysia, authoritarian country with some liberalization. The defining moment was 1969. In 1969, after the 1969 crisis, we see state intervention and the rise of GLCs, at that time called public enterprises. UMNO decides to use these GLCs as the basis for growth, And in the process, he tends to bypass big businesses, especially Chinese businesses. Now here, let me get to the defining issues. I want to look at two things. One, the nature of the state. My focus in today's lecture will be on the political context of this intervention. What were the political factors behind the states, behind the way in which the state intervened in the economy? The second part will be on business. And here I'm focusing on GLCs because GLCs have become a key player. So what is the nature of the state? In the literature, Malaysia is known as a single dominant party state. It is also known as a state which is referred to as an electoral authoritarian state. What this means is we have a single dominant party which does expose itself to elections, and this party can lose. Other single dominant party states, of course, is the PAP in Singapore, in this part of the world. We have others, of course, Vietnam, and then we have China's party. The question that now arises is this. When we talk about the concept of ownership and control, which is basically a concept used in the business literature, how does it work when you're dealing with a strong state that is so deeply immersed also in the corporate sector? This means that we have to refine here our understanding of the concept of control. Ownership doesn't matter anymore. Even if the state has minimal ownership, they can still intervene in a company where the owner has majority control. And I'll show you some evidence of that. So here, the definition that we are most concerned with, which is unlike the definition you will see in the business literature, is the concept of control in this context. How a controlling actor has the influence to determine decision-making among key actors in companies, the managerial members of these companies. How do they influence them? The method we are using is, interestingly enough, it fell on our laps, the GLCs. If you look at the GLCs, if you just look at the historical evolution of the GLCs, it tells you the story of the interventionist state. It tells you the story of how the state intervened. It tells you the story of what happened when the state intervened. It also tells you the story of what happens when there is a political transition. Malaysia is a country where we have now had a few prime ministers. We are into our 6th prime minister. So I'll take you now through history. Let's start with 1970. In 1970, when the new economic policy was introduced, the purpose behind the new economic policy was now the state would cast aside its laissez-faire economy and the state would now intervene very actively in the corporate sector. The purpose of the intervention of the state through the new economic policy, this affirmative action-based policy, was very clear. The state wanted to redistribute wealth more equitably, and the state wanted to eradicate poverty. No one can deny that these goals were not noble. These were extremely important goals. The NEP was a policy that the country needed. The NEP involved state intervention to rectify the problems that had occurred under colonial rule. And under colonial rule, the bypassing of Malays in business was a key problem. As you can see in the figures for 1971, these are the key players in the economy in 1971 were foreign companies owning about 61% of the economy, and family firms, predominantly Chinese firms, owning about 23%. While much is made about Chinese ownership and control, the fact of the matter is they were nothing compared to foreign capital. The foreign capitalists were the key players in the economy. And the state intervenes in this economy very carefully by creating public enterprises. They are well funded, and these public enterprises go out and buy out the assets of these foreign companies. The other dimension of affirmative action, which we pay little attention to, was its focus on education. One of the key emphasis of the NEP was to create good schools, manned by great teachers, and to take poor kids out of the kampongs, send them to these schools, well trained, they go on to university, both domestically and abroad. And this batch of students, this generation of students who were privy to the NEP became Malaysia's new Bumiputra middle class. When people look upon Malaysia and its affirmative action policy, it is this success story that they talk about. How did we, in one generation, create a new Bumiputra middle class? And then, in 1981, something happened. We got a new prime minister. His name was Mahathir Mohamad. When Mahathir Mohamad came to power, although he was one of the architects of the NEP, and he had long called for state intervention, he felt that by 1981, the GLCs, or the public enterprises as they were then called, had done quite well. Within a span of 10 years, equity attributable to Bumiputras had increased from 2% to 12%, 10 percentage points in a period of just 10 years. Remarkable what had happened in that sense. But he decided that, look, the purpose of the NEP really is that 30% figure. The purpose of the NEP is to create Bumiputra capitalists, Bumiputra businessmen, not GLCs. So I'm going to change things around now. The emphasis on education diminished. The focus now moved to business. And this was a prime minister consumed by business. This was a prime minister, most of you remember his books, The Malay Dilemma, but there's another book which he wrote. It is a book about small and medium-scale enterprises and how to develop small and medium-scale enterprises. So this is a prime minister who's a doctor writing a book on small and medium-scale enterprises to help guide people how to develop businesses. He was very interested in business. Much attention and focus was channeled to the creation of this Bumiputra capitalist class. And one policy that was created, that was used to create this Bumiputra capitalist class was privatization. Companies that had been acquired now by the government through the public enterprises were now being privatized to an elite group of people, well-connected businessmen. So if you look at the figure for 1997, this is a defining moment, 1997. Actually, these are the figures for 1996. I want you to look at these figures very carefully because here I'm focusing on 1996 simply because 1996 was Mahathir's peak in terms of his achievements. Look at what he had achieved. He had created his vision. And here you can see prominent businessmen, Halim Saad, Tajuddin Ramli, Rashid Hussain, Azman Hashim, Yahya Ahmad. He had created a dynamic new corporate captains. But you will also see here that even in 1996, among the leading companies were government-owned companies, Telecoms, Tenaga, Maybank, Petronas. These were all publicly listed companies, but they were what we call partial privatizations. And then another defining moment in Malaysian history, the 1997 crisis, when all this fell apart. The manner in which these companies grew was such that they were so highly dependent on banks. And as I told you, under the developmental state, the banks are very important. The banks were used by Mahathir to help develop this capitalist class. Many of them were so deeply mired in debt, the whole thing collapsed during the currency crisis. And then from there, you see now the shift. The shift occurred in the sense that we see the move now from private businesses to GLCs. GLCs now coming to the fore and taking control. It was only the GLCs who could come in and take control of these companies. Only the GLCs had the money to do so. And the GLCs were used to bail out these companies. What is also important is this. If you look at the figures for 2001, what you will see is very clearly the fall of Bumiputra capitalists. 4 years after the crisis, if you look at the list of people who are Bumiputras in this list, you only see one, Rashid Hussain at number 14, and Azman Hashim AMB Bank at 23. Rashid Hussain would soon lose control of RHB because of a feud with Mahathir, and Taib Mahmud, Chief Minister of Sarawak, would come in and take charge of RHB, take over RHB. You can see here now extreme political intervention within the corporate sector. This is not the kind of state intervention that we were talking about under the developmental state. We move forward now to 2013. Now, when we wrote this book, we focused on 2013 because 2013, it was a defining year. It was the year of the elections. It was a year when the data was very available to us. We could see what had happened just before the election, what had happened just after the election. So we fixed on 2013 as the database for our book. Look at 2013. Look here at the number of Bumiputra capitalists in terms of where they are. Who are they? The first thing that stands out about this is that there's only two, Sapura Kencana, Samsudin family, and again Azman Hashim at number 20. The key figures in the year 2001 are now the GLCs. 12 years later, the key figures in the corporate sector are still the GLCs. The GLCs had emerged as the key players in the economy. And they had sustained themselves. If you look at the list of the top 10 companies, top 20 companies in 2001 and 2013, they're almost the same. What does this say about the quality of the GLCs? Now, this is where things get very interesting. One assumes that immediately when you talk about GLCs, they are useless. They can't perform. They are all run on the mill and they'll just fall away. But that's not what the figures are showing. You're seeing here extremely dynamic companies maintaining their performance as the top companies in the country. What is also interesting, by 2013, 7 of the top 10 companies were GLCs. Half of the top 30 are GLCs. No Malays in the top 10. And what is also interesting here is the emergence in 2013 of foreign firms. Foreign firms are becoming a key player now in the economy. It's something we should pay close attention to. But I'd like to go on and show you all the figures for 2016. These are the figures for last year. And if you look at these figures for last year, there are some important points I would like to point out. The purpose of the interventionist state was to nurture domestic enterprises. Look at the top companies in the country today. There are no companies in the top half that were nurtured by the state. No Bhumiputras in the top 40. Where have all the Bhumiputra capitalists gone? Azman Hashim is there, but Azman Hashim's status as a major player in AMB Bank has now diminished significantly. You have to go down to number 42 before you suddenly see MMC Corporation Syed Mokhtar. And Syed Mokhtar is an interesting name because he's also very well connected. The persistent fall of Malay elites since 1997. Privatization. So much has been said about privatization, and privatization being the panacea for an economy ridden with GLCs. Show me one company here, privatized company, and we've had it since 1986, which is a standout example of a successful privatized company. And please don't point to Tenaga Nasional and so on and so forth, because they are not privatized companies. They are partial privatizations. They have and have always remained under government control. I'm bringing this up because I want you all to think carefully. Now, what is our remedy for the problems that we are facing today? Most people say privatization. And I'm saying to you, okay, privatization, we've had it since 1986. Show me the successes. Secondly, who are you going to privatize to? We already have a problem in this country with the wealth and income disparities, and we don't want to create a new rich elite in the process. So how do we do a just redistribution of wealth too? Important questions here. Apart from the GLCs, which figure large in this case, what is also interesting is the number of, and I've highlighted them, family firms. The number of family firms is quite high. This is something we have to pay attention to. But what is also interesting about these family firms is that there's no concentration of corporate wealth here. They're all quite diverse. They are all, in fact, in competition with each other. If you are thinking that these people are now all cooperating and all running together in this economy, perish the thought. A book which I did in 1999 called Chinese Business in Malaysia, Accumulation, Accommodation, and Ascendance. I proved in that book that the reason for the dynamism of Chinese businesses was because they were exposed to extreme competition. It was not because of cooperation. This competition is still well prevalent. In fact, what is most noted when you look at these companies is that most of them are not working with other Chinese, but they seem to have close links with the political elite. So much for intra-ethnic Chinese cooperation. The other important things here, if you look at this list very carefully, if you compare the list of 1970 with the list of 2016, one of the first things that hits you is where are all the manufacturing companies, where are all the industrial elites. The industrial companies of old have fallen away. Industrial companies have not been investing in R&D. They have been fearful of the state. They are fearful of expropriation by a strong state that has hampered them from growing. So here, when you look at this, this is a very scary picture in terms of where is our industrial elite, where are all the companies that are involved in high-tech industries, in innovation, highly innovative companies. If you look at this list, we're looking at companies, especially even among the GLCs, companies involved in utilities, in finance, in construction, and property development. It's not going to take you anywhere in the long run. There are important differences here when you look at this. There are important differences here because when you look at these figures from 1971 to 2016, what is the first thing that's going to hit you is that many of the outcomes that we are seeing here today has been influenced or shaped by who was the prime minister at particular moments in Malaysian history. But the key question that I want to focus on today is this. What are the implications of a single dominant state in the context of this overwhelming influence of GLCs? My focus now is on the GLCs because the value of the assets are about, let me rephrase that. My focus today is not on the GLCs. My focus today is on the GLICs, government-linked investment companies. When we started this project, we knew this was the scale and scope of the work ahead of us. So we said we'll start small. We will focus just on the GLICs. And we leave the GLCs for the second stage. We are now entering the second stage where we are going into the study of the GLCs. My focus today is on the GLICs, and my focus today is on two concepts, institutions and key actors. Now, who are these GLICs that I keep going on about? GLICs are government-linked investment companies. It was the government who defined them as GLICs. Who are they? GLICs are the 7 companies who are major players in terms of their ownership and control of the corporate sector. Here is a structure of the GLICs, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet at the top, the Minister of Finance, and then if you look down, you will see the first one, Minister of Finance Incorporated. There you are, the company. Minister of Finance Incorporated, which owns 2 other GLICs, Khazanah and PNB, Permodalan Nasional Berhad. And then on the to the right, to my right, you'll see the Employees Provident Fund, KWAP. The KWAP is the fund for the retirement fund for civil servants. The Tabung Haji, the Pilgrimage Fund, and the Lembaga Tabung Angkatan Tentera, LTAT. LTAT is the retirement fund for members of the armed forces. In terms of the volume of companies that they have, these 7 companies, just these 7 companies. These are here what we did is a network analysis of the companies in terms of their direct control, indirect control, minority control. And if you go down the list, we're talking about, if you put them all together, 68,000 companies. And these companies, let me say here, when we talk about these companies, this is, I'll come to this, but basically I'm just giving you a snapshot of how wide their scope and scale is. But let me take you through these companies. First one, MOF Inc. This is just MOF Inc. Minister of Finance Incorporated. It's a holding company. It is under the Minister of Finance. It's under the control of a division in the Ministry of Finance called the Government Investment Companies Division, the GIC. Basically, its mode of control is majority equity in companies and golden shares. Golden shares, one of the unique features about this company is its golden shares. Through the golden shares, what that means is if you have a golden share in a company, you can have significant control over these companies. I know you can't read it, but don't worry. It's just to give you an idea of MOF Inc.'s scope. The next one, PNB, the Unit Trust Fund, created in 1981, along with Amanah Saham Nasional Berhad, the Unit Trust Scheme. Money invested in the Unit Trust Scheme, that money is now being used to acquire companies. This is a major trust fund, one of the leading corporate owners in the country today. And among the major companies under its control includes huge enterprises like Sime Darby and Malayan Banking. The next one, Khazanah, Malaysia's sovereign wealth fund, created in 1993 by Mahathir. Khazanah is interesting because it was supposed to be a sort of vanguard to lead the country into areas such as innovation, high tech. It goes into those kinds of things. It's also prominent because it goes into joint ventures with a lot of companies. It was famous for buying Jack Ma's company. What is Jack Ma's company? Alibaba, how could I forget? Alibaba invested in Alibaba and made 1 billion when it sold off its interest, 1 billion realized profits. So it goes into those kinds of investments, invest a lot in, but having said that, in foreign companies, having said that, they also have interest in major companies like UEM Sunrise, Malaysian Airlines, CIMB, the bank, CIMB. They also have a stake in the healthcare company, IHH, Malaysian Airports, Tenaga, Telecom is it is most important because it controls the utilities. Then we have EPF, the Employees Provident Fund, the 7th largest retirement fund in the world. Extensive presence. Look at EPF. EPF basically just invests in many companies. It's an equity holding company in that sense. But having said that, it is still quite a prominent company in terms that it has a majority interest in major companies such as RHB Capital, MRCB, MBSB, Malaysian Building Society Berhad. It may now be taking over M-Bank, or there might be a merger M-Bank, EPF. This is one company which is really important to watch, mainly because of the volume of funds available to it and its investment capacity. KWAP, the pension fund for civil servants, much smaller in scale compared to EPF. Of course, the number of people who contribute to KWAP is also much smaller in terms of, because it's just civil servants. Its corporate structure, however, is very similar to EPF. But unlike EPF, it doesn't really have doesn't have a majority interest in many companies, but it's now being rectified. They are now beginning to talk, there's talk about taking over some, again, interestingly, M-Bank, taking over the stake of ANZ's stake in M-Bank. It is also acquiring an interest in Bursa, Malaysia. And then we have LTAT. LTAT is interesting because LTAT is an armed forces fund, but this company has been very active in the economy. And among the two major companies under its control are Bosted Holdings, the major plantation companies, which owns your competitor, Nottingham University is owned by Bosted, and of course, Affin Holdings, Affin Bank, a major player in that sense. Another company which is not here, but is also important, is Pharmaniaga, a very prominent drug company. It's involved in a diverse number of sectors. Also important to watch because of its close links with the Ministry of Defense. It comes under the control of the Ministry of Defense, though ultimately reporting to the Minister of Finance too. And then we have the Tabung Haji. This is one company we really should watch because of all the other 6 that we have seen, okay, leave aside MOF Inc., of all the others that we have seen so far, the other 5, LTH is one company that seems to be mired in a lot of controversy. One would have thought Tabung Haji and controversies, the two just don't go together. But unfortunately, that is the case. And I'll come to the reason as to why Tabung Haji later is so mired in all these problems. But before I get to that, let's just talk more about these 7 GLICs. The book is about the 7 GLICs. It's a 300-page book. Don't get scared by the size. Most of it is figures like this. But the reason why I'm drawing attention to the size, the length of the book, is because of the importance of these companies. I can tell you now that even when we started this project, we had no clue that these companies were this important in the economy. So if you look at these GLICs all in red, and look at the companies that they control, publicly listed companies that they control, and here they're all in yellow. I must say, for this book, we only studied the GLIC's ownership and control of the top 100. The top 100 publicly listed companies. We did not go down the list to all 900. We are doing that now. We'll do that now in the second stage. But for this stage, we are just talking now, just looking at the top 100. They have majority ownership of 35 publicly listed companies. And here you're getting an idea of how wide their interest is in the corporate sector. In terms of market capitalization, they control about 42% of the market capitalization of the entire Bursa. Let's look now at forms of control. The group structure. Using the group structure, it's very important in the business literature because it's a mode of control, and the pyramid structure. You can see it here. Here I'm focusing only on utilities, Tenaga. Look at how they control the utilities. The partial privatized company, the use of the golden share, very important, direct and indirect control. but ultimately more than 50%. I'm just showing you the traits, the trends through which they own companies. The next one, Sime Darby, one of the largest plantation companies in the world, a merger of with two other companies, Guthrie's and Golden Hope, to create this huge enterprise. Sime Darby, controlled ultimately by P&B, but have multiple shareholders. Most of these companies have multiple, publicly listed companies have multiple shareholders, but one GLIC is usually the majority shareholder. In this case, it is, of course, P&B. The media. How can we not deal with the media? The control of the press. Media Premier, the group. The control, look at Media Premier. Media Premier was the company in which most of the media companies in the country were situated under. So you have NTV7, NTV9, TV3, Berita Harian, NST, they're all there. Media Premier is a very important company, and this shows you how they're controlled ultimately by the state. And here I draw attention to the two men on the right, managerial control by key individuals, Sharil Rizza Rizwan, Abdul Rahman Ahmad. Two key people who are ultimately having control over Media Premier. Although one of the key majority shareholders is EPF, the fact of the matter, there's this company, this obscure company called Gabungan Kasturi, and who's behind Gabungan Kasturi? It's these two men. I'm sure most of you all are familiar with these two men. There's one more slide here on this I want to show you. This is construction and property development. I brought up construction and property development. I'm focusing here primarily on UEM Sunrise, a company created by a Chinese businessman, Tong Koi Ong. Tong, as you know, he controls the edge. A very dynamic businessman, created Sunrise, later taken over by UEM. Look at the extremely complex ownership pattern here for the control of the construction company. Why did I put up construction and property development? I put up construction and property development, although we had so many other companies I could have put up. I put up construction simply because one of the key points made by the Prime Minister Najib, when he came to power, was that he is going to relinquish ownership of the GLCs to the private sector. His famous words, the government has no business being in business, repeating words touted by Margaret Thatcher, for example, and Ronald Reagan. But here what we are seeing is the takeover of major Chinese-owned construction companies. And here we are looking at companies like SP Satir, Gamuda, IJM, all have fallen under the control of GLCs or GLICs. It raises the question as to why is this government so interested in the construction and property development sector. I think you know the answer to that. Just walk outside and you will see evidence of what's going on in terms of construction and how lucrative that sector is. Having dealt now with institutions, the GLICs and the GLCs, I want to move on to my next stage where I talk about the key actors. Who are the key actors? How does this all work? To understand how all this works, one needs to understand who are the key actors behind this. But before I go into the contemporary period, let me go back to 1996, a defining moment again. In 1996, when Mahathir created all these corporate captains, they were prominent figures in the corporate sector. Halim Saad, and look at the range of companies that he owned. Tajuddin Ramle, Wan Azmi, Wan Hamza, Samshuddin Abu Hassan, Ahmad Sebi. Why were they all prominent? They were all closely linked to then Finance Minister Daim Zainuddin. They were all Daim's protégés. They were all groomed by Daim under a company called Paremba. He groomed them and then later allowed them to become key corporate figures in corporate Malaysia. Then we have a second list. I put up this list because these lists of names are very interesting. Kamaruddin Jafar, MP even today. Kamaruddin Muhammad Noor. I put up these names because here's a different list of people linked with the next the next finance minister after Daim, Anwar Ibrahim. But what is interesting about these people is that unlike the earlier list that I showed you, where all of them are professionals, these people were politicians. Politicians were now entering into the corporate sector, and politicians were now becoming key players in the corporate sector. The nexus between politics and business was changing. Politicians now had direct ownership and control of key companies. If you go on to the next list, Azman Hashim, and I put up this list just to show you all some of the issue of nepotism, allegations of nepotism against Mahathir, and here's the reason why. Mirzan Mahathir, and look at the list of companies, Mukhzani Mahathir, Mukhris Mahathir. The nexus between politics and business in the period leading up to 1996 was a mix of patronage, nepotism, one can include corruption. I have one more person down there, as you can see. Ahmad Zahid Hamidi. I'm sure you all know who he is. Our Deputy Prime Minister, no less, famous for his control over a company called Kirtham Holdings, and at that time, an Anwar associate, UMNO youth leader, until Anwar got kicked out, and he went into jail for a short while, but rehabilitated, and now back today, our Deputy Prime Minister. And now we come to the current day, the shift. When we were doing this study, I remember my research assistants coming to me. I said, I want a list of all the UMNO people who have ownership and control of companies. And they came to me and they said, it's zero. I said, come on, this is something wrong. There's something wrong here. There's no way this is possible. Zero. A shift had occurred. Just look at these two tables. Khazana. If you look at Khazana, what is interesting about Khazana, UMNO there are three people there. Khazana is interesting because these three people are Najib, as chairman, prime minister. He sits there by virtue of the fact he's UMNO chairman. He's prime minister. He sits there, so he's Khazana's chairman. And the second finance minister, Najib sits there by virtue of the fact he's also finance minister. The second finance minister, Husni, UMNO. And the third one was Nur Muhammad Yaakob, an UMNO MP, deputy chairman. Formerly UMNO MP, deputy chairman. I'll come to him soon. But look at the others. PNB 0, EPF 0, LTH, Tabung Haji 4, KWOB 0, LTAT 0, LTH 4. 4 UMNO people sitting in LTH. And one wonders again why we had these problems with LTH. Multiple directorships. When we look at multiple directorships involving GLCs and GLICs, 0. UMNO. What we do see here now is the rise of corporate professionals. Corporate professionals had risen. The other big number are the bureaucrats. They are in large numbers. And of course, ex-bureaucrats. Who are these UMNO people? So here, UMNO link directors, as we found in 2013. As I said, Najib is there by virtue of his position in government, along with Husni, at the time finance minister, and Nur Muhammad Yaakob. Nur Aisahuddin, UMNO, an UMNO member, UMNO Overseas Club before, served in the Prime Minister's Department in 2008. And then we have Abdul Aziz, MP for Baling, Kedah. And then we have Nur Jaslan, now he has stood down, of course, but at that time, MP, UMNO. Who else do we have? Muhammad Aziz, Rosni Soha, UMNO Wanita, sitting in the UMNO Supreme Council. So interesting, but the point is, the list is small, few and far between. A significant shift had occurred. UMNO leaders, ex-UMNO leaders who were also there, who we found. Abdul Ghani Othman, ex-UMNO MB for Johor, Sam Darby chairman. Muhammad Isa Abdul Samad. How can we not know Isa Samad? He's in the news these days. Ex-Menteri Besar of, and also UMNO Vice President, Felda Global Ventures. And of course, Rafida Aziz, who is in Air Asia. Now, I want to be very clear. Rafida Aziz, I don't think really has a major role in Air Asia. She's there by virtue of the fact that she was an ex-minister and she can facilitate things with the bureaucracy because of who she was, ex-minister of trade. But Isa Samad is different. Isa Samad is there by virtue of the fact that I think there's a lot of politics involved in his appointment. Look at the company in particular, Felda, a very important company because of the role it plays in the economy. Abdul Ghani Othman, we haven't seen much about, I don't think there's much to say about Abdul Ghani Othman, but Isa Samad. So it varies, there are differences here. The point I'm trying to make is, it's very much more complex than it seems. A lot more things are going on here. Key actors, and who they are and why they are there. We have to look at them individually and analyze them differently. They all play different roles. It's not so black and white. Sitting bureaucrats, I'll go through this very quickly because it's not important. Sitting bureaucrats, GLCs, we expect them to be there also to some extent. Ex-bureaucrats, yes, the ex-bureaucrats are now coming in large numbers, okay. They are filling in the space now abdicated by these ex-UMNO members. Let me talk about the new professional elite. The role of Nur Muhammad Yaqub. This is one of our major findings in the book. Although I mustn't take credit for it because the people had been talking about it in politics and in government. But here's the point. Nur Muhammad Yaqub, who is he? Nur Muhammad Yaqub was, for a long time, with Bank Negara, spent about 30 years in Bank Negara. And then he rose to the position of Deputy Assistant Governor. And in 1994, he was mired in what was known as the Bank Negara foreign exchange scandal. A loss of about 9.3 billion ringgit at that time was lost. You all do know about it because it's now in the news. Royal Commission has been formed to look into the scandal now. Subsequently, in 1997, when the currency crisis, he resigned. He took responsibility for it, and he resigned from Bank Negara. He joined a few companies. Man Long sat as director there. He resigned to go into the private sector, and then the turning point came with the 1997 crisis. And Mahathir, mired in this currency crisis, not knowing what to do, suddenly remembered Nur Muhammad Yaqub and the role that he had played in the forex exchange markets. He knew the foreign exchange market, brought him back in. Mahathir has a feud with Anwar. Anwar gets kicked out. And Nur Muhammad Yaqub then becomes Mahathir's closest advisor. Nur Muhammad Yaqub then takes charge of all the GLCs and ailing companies that were taken over by these GLCs. And Nur Muhammad Yaqub goes to Mahathir and tells him, look, these are very important companies. We have to turn them around. And he brings in a group of people, so-called turnaround experts, people such as Sharil Riza Rizwan, young chaps at that time, Abdul Rahman Ahmad, Bakay, the other people, Bakay Saleh, Wahid Omar. He brings in all these people. You all know all these men. Very prominent business figures today. At that time, very young men. Even Mahathir asked Nur Muhammad Yaqub, why are you bringing in all these men? He said, they have the know-how. Asman Yahya had trained them in Danahata. Trained them, they were good. Very competent men. Trained in Cambridge and Oxford, no less. Extremely well qualified. Extremely intelligent and articulate. They know how to run companies. They know how to turn around companies. Nur Muhammad Yaqub, with these men, then turned them around. The next defining moment was when Mahathir stood down and Abdullah Ahmad Badawi became Prime Minister. And Abdullah Ahmad Badawi made Nur Muhammad Yaqub Finance Minister, second Finance Minister. And he told him to revamp the GLC. And the GLC transformation program was introduced by Abdullah. It was a defining moment because a real transformation occurred in the GLCs. And most of the politicians, it was then that the politicians were taken out of the GLCs. And it was then the professionals came in, and we can see now the revamp happening within the GLCs. So this was the shift that we just saw. When we look at this shift, what is also interesting is this. Key actors. The two most important people we need to look at is who is the managing director and who's the chairman. And here you can see, the managing directors are all professionals. Azman Mokhtar, Sharul Ritza, Ismi, Lodin. All professionals in the corporate sector. But look at who are the chairmen. They are not professionals. They're even UMNO members and bureaucrats. Control these two men, you control the GLCs. This was the shift that we saw. This allows them to use the GLCs, if they wish, in a manner in which can benefit them. I've just been told I've got 5 minutes, and I'm nowhere near ending. So please bear with me. I'll take on a few more minutes. I cannot have a lecture on state intervention and not deal with the banking sector. In the developmental state, the banks are very important. Who controls the banks can control the economy. In 1999, Mahathir woke up one morning and said, there are too many banks in this country. It's time to consolidate. There are 59 financial institutions. I want a consolidation exercise. We had, at that time, a population of around 22 million. There's just too many. There was no need for that. But a consolidation exercise was pushed through. And it was pushed through by then Finance Minister Daim Zainuddin. And Daim Zainuddin, in this consolidation exercise, tried to bring many of these banks under his direct or indirect control. It led to a feud between Mahathir and Daim got removed from the corporate sector. Thus the rise of Nur Muhammad Yaakob as key advisor to Mahathir. Here you can see the banks. Suddenly from 59 banks, we are down to 10. And today, here is the banking sector. Look at the banking sector today. What is important about the banking sector today, which is very important for us to understand, is this. Look at the presence of the state. If you look at all these banks now, they are under GLC. Even Azman Hashim now will be losing out his interest. His control over the bank, his ownership of the bank is now about 12%. The next key actor in M-Bank will be EPF, maybe K1. So the banks today, if you look at the 9 banks, 7 of them are under the control of the state, 6 of them under the control of the state. We have 1 under foreign control, and then we have, of course, Public Bank, Tay Hong Piao, and Hong Leong Bank, probably 2 of the most dynamic companies in this country. There's another financial institution that I want to draw your attention to, which you all may not know about, but it is very important for us to understand, what is known as the development financial institutions. Very important. These are what we call development-based financial institutions. Agro Bank, Bank Pembangunan, Bank Industry, Export Bank. Banks that were created to channel funds to key sectors in the economy to drive these sectors. SME Bank, probably one of the most important banks in the country today in terms of the role they play in helping to develop SMEs in this country. All of them, interestingly enough, rather well managed, except with the possible exception now, Bank Rakyat. So you can see here banks, well-managed banks, playing an important role in the economy too. It's not to say that all the GLCs have been run aground or are being run aground by the state. So, state intervention, what are the trends? If you look at the developmental state, basically what it involves is a nexus between state and business that guide industrial policy, implemented by high-quality bureaucracy, aided by banks. But the nature of the state matters. What kind of state do we have? We have had an authoritarian regime. An authoritarian regime, the reason why they have been able to do this is because of the way in which they have trampled on independent institutions, the independence of independent institutions. But interestingly enough about the state, this is a state which is also being called a responsive state. If it knows that there are problems that are happening, they know how to respond. And they do respond. And they have responded at many a time in ways in which they have addressed problems. 1986, when we had the crisis, Mahathir responded accordingly. He did it again in 1997. Abdullah did it very well in 2004 when he came to power under his 9th Malaysia Plan, one of the best Malaysia plans I've read in terms of how to revamp the state, highly responsive to demands from society of our politicians to reform society and government. And you can see it in his plan, in the 9th Malaysia Plan. Najib, when he came to power in 2009, after the 2008 financial crisis, came up with a whole slew of reform ideas. The new economic model, the ETP, the Economic Transformation Plan, the GTP, the Government Transformation Plan, an extremely important plan and extremely well written, addressing key problems. If you read that, it's an honest account of the problems in the country today. And he promised to respond. Whether he has done so or not, we'll come to that. But here, what we can see here in terms of state-business nexus, you can see there's a constant transition. First it was GLCs, and then under Razak, then it goes into big business under Mahathir, it moves to SMEs. Abdullah focuses a lot on SMEs, and under Najib we are back to GLCs. And the form of intervention, it can be both programmatic as well as predatory. In terms of programmatic, I said the NEP, programmatic, a very good policy at the time, trying to deal with serious problems in the country involving equity redistribution and a focus on education. Under Mahathir, a mix, partial privatizations, trying to raise dynamic enterprises, did do, well, some good. There was some, not everyone failed, I mean, Astro did quite well, Maxis was okay, YTL, okay, got all these rents, but did all right, even went abroad, all these companies went abroad. Astro and Maxis created brand products, it can work if you choose the right people. The rise of money politics, another key issue that emerged under Mahathir's period. Abdullah, more programmatic, reformed all the GLCs and spent a lot of time trying to nurture SMEs. We may make fun of Abdullah, sleeping prime minister, but when you look back on him now and some of the things he did, they are very telling things about the reforms that he introduced. And then Najib, a loss of focus. Where exactly are we going with Najib? And serious allegations of a predatory state. And these predatory features have emerged and prevailed because of the concentration of political power in the office of the executive. That is the problem. How do we deal with this? How do we re-empower these institutions to ensure checks and balances? The other problem was picking the wrong winners, and I gave you a list of the wrong winners. Politicians going into business. I showed you all evidence of this. The susceptibility to corruption. I needn't go into that. We already know enough about this. And persistent patronage and escalating money politics. The problem now of growing money politics, not only in UMNO, or if we've seen it now also in the opposition, but what of the general elections. Look at the volume of money spent in the general elections. In terms of corporate control, they have been different under different prime ministers. Under Mahathir and Dime, extremely involved in the economy, but not so after 1999. Abdullah, definitely not very involved in the economy. Najib, selectively involved. I don't think Najib is sitting there and watching all these companies very closely like what Mahathir would do when he was prime minister, or Dime. He's selectively involved. When it suits his purpose, he will act. He has got competent people running it. That's fine for now. The state of play. What we have in UMNO today is a fragmented UMNO. A lot of power now transferred to the office of the executive. Unprecedented concentration of executive and political power. And the key company here, the super entity, is Minister of Finance Incorporated in this core periphery structure that you just saw. But here's the thing. Who's in charge? After all, MOF Inc. is just a division in the Ministry of Finance. MOF Inc. doesn't even have a board of directors. Who's in charge and who's pulling all the strings? And as for the GLCs, and if we looked at them, the GLCs, they are not well coordinated. They all run separately. They all run on their own. I don't see that kind of integration which I would have expected from these GLCs, after all, ultimately controlled by the Minister of Finance. And what does this control allow the executive to do? Reward supporters, deny rents to challengers. You're seeing this happening today. The distribution of rents in forms of loans and contracts through the control of the banks to build loyalty. A shift we have seen from management between the GLCs. Shift management around. Some of the people I showed you all at 2013 are no longer there. Isa Samad didn't perform in FGV, now he's in SPAD. Why? The abuse of social policies. I want to come to that. The abuse of social policies. This is a very important point. There is a thriving capitalist base in this country. I really do believe that, because we did a study on the SMEs, and I was shocked at the thriving capitalist, at the thriving entrepreneurial capacity among our SMCs. Dynamic companies, but worried about public policies like affirmative action, which has the capacity to expropriate their wealth at will. And we have seen that happening in the case of the banks. These were powerful banks owned by prominent companies. And one day the Prime Minister wakes up and says, consolidated, and that's the end of the banks. That's the end of the ownership of the banks. The power of the strong state and its capacity to take away wealth through the pronouncement of a public policy. And what can you do? This is the fear. When Najib came to power, he looked upon the state of, it was a bad state of the economy, 2008, the crisis, 2009 when he came to power, he said, okay, let's do something. He spoke to his advisors, and everyone told him, do away with this policy. And he announced it. No more affirmative action. It was headlines in the newspapers, the Star headlines, no more affirmative action. And then came the backlash through groups such as Perkasa, and as well as, at that time, the key advisor, Mahathir. And so he backtracked. And then he introduced what he called market-friendly affirmative action. The 10th Malaysia Plan has it. Market-friendly affirmative action. After saying no more. And then because of the backlash, he told Pemandu, okay, never mind, market friendly. It's an oxymoron, isn't it? It just doesn't work. But the real test to see whether it worked, read the 11th Malaysia Plan. If the 10th Malaysia Plan expounded market-friendly affirmative action, there's nothing of it in the 11th Malaysia Plan. The 11th Malaysia Plan is supposed to review the 10th Malaysia Plan before it gets on to what it's going to do for the next 5 years. It's reduced to a footnote. What does it say about the government and even its own understanding of the role of affirmative action? And yet, in 2013, soon after the election, when Barisan Nasional lost the popular vote, 5 months later, in September 2013, Mahathir announces his own affirmative action in business plan called the Bumiputra Economic Empowerment Policy, targeting Bumiputras in business. 31 billion ringgit for contracts to be distributed through the GLCs. The GLCs, he himself says in his speech, will be the vanguard for implementing these policies. And we have the vendor program. We have vendor development programs, can be extremely well run if open and transparent, to be employed to do this. A political agenda now being used, social policies now fulfilling a political agenda with the GLICs and GLCs now targeted to implement it. So my conclusions, the politics of the single dominant party, we have seen today a power shift involving the nexus between politics and business at the federal level. I am not saying that the same situation prevails at the state level. In fact, I'm here dealing only with 7 GLICs and 35 GLCs, publicly listed companies. Now, there's a whole slew of other companies. We are looking at them too. We are looking at the state level, and the way it operates at the state level is completely different. But my focus is on the federal level. And at the federal level, we are seeing a major shift. We have seen the demise of powerful UMNO politicians in business. A very good thing, actually. But now power is concentrated in the office of the Minister of Finance. And the Minister of Finance now is the main source of patronage. You want patronage, you go to the Minister of Finance. There's nobody else to go to. If in the 1990s there were others, and they created a whole slew of businessmen who were politicians, you could go to them now, perish the thought, it doesn't happen anymore. Extreme concentration, as I said, of wealth. There seems to be a clear reluctance to create a well-endowed UMNO capitalist class. That is the case. And this is contributing to the feuding that you're seeing within UMNO. And as for UMNO itself, its assets, its key companies, CIMB, TV3, NST, the cooperative KUB, UEM, Renong, all taken over, all under the control of the GLCs. UMNO itself now owns only one company, Utusan. And Utusan, as you know, is a loss-making company. I don't think it's going to contribute much to UMNO's coffers. And what of the bureaucracy? The bureaucracy which is so important, that plays that role in implementing policies. Even if you have good policies, you must have that bureaucracy. Abdullah, in his 9 Malaysia plan, in the last chapter of the 9 Malaysia plan, he devoted it to the bureaucracy. The purpose of the last chapter was how to improve the public delivery system. Because he himself knew, no matter how good your policies are, if you don't have a public delivery system that can deliver these policies, it's not going to work. And even before he left, he spoke of the problems with the public bureaucracy. He called them little Napoleons. And what this means is there's little coherence, there's institutional decline, there's lack of coordination. Formal and informal new institutions have emerged. Under Mahathir, he created a whole slew of think tanks to advise him on public policies. One major one was ISIS. Under Abdullah, he had what was known as the fourth floor boys. Those young boys who he planted in the fourth floor, who advised him on many of his policies, informal. Najib, when he came to power, he formalized it. He created Pemandu. And Pemandu was under the Prime Minister's office to advise him on public policies, not the bureaucrats. And suddenly you see now a big feud between Pemandu and the bureaucracy. Today, Pemandu is no longer under the Prime Minister's office. Showing you the problems, the contestations now between politicians and the bureaucracy. So what does this mean now? I don't want to end without some suggestions on where do we go from here. It's not all that bad, you know. After all that, why do I say that? First, the internal managerial reforms, already done. Competent people, let them be. Give them the autonomy. Some things we can do tomorrow. The Minister of Finance, let me repeat that. Let me rephrase that. The Prime Minister cannot be the Minister of Finance. That is something that can be done tomorrow, and that will help rectify many of the problems that we already have today. And to overcome this problem of a government that both regulates and owns GLCs, institutional autonomy. Why can't we give institutional autonomy to the Securities Commission? MECC has proven that it can do a good job. But I think we all know it's not doing enough. Bank Negara. The creation of an oversight body. We had before what was known as the Ministry for Public Enterprises. Some people used to mock it. But many countries which have what they call SOEs, we call it GLCs, have such ministries. They have operational oversight. They coordinate. I can tell you now, if you go out there and you ask even ministry people, how many GLCs do we have? They don't know. Nobody knows. It's so dispersed. It's mentioned in the book by one Saiful in his foreword, and he tried to do some research on how many GLCs are there. Nobody could tell him. So we can put it all under one body and get it back into shape. And because they're so ubiquitous in the economy, they're so important, they can play a major role in the economy if they are run well. And as I said, professional managers with autonomy, but accountable to Parliament, select committees, headed by opposition members. Can these be done tomorrow? Yes. They're not that difficult to do. And they can help revamp these things and make the interventionist state far more effective. Affirmative action. Nobody wants to discuss it, it's just too sensitive. I want to talk about affirmative action in business. That is something we have to do immediately. Affirmative action to eradicate poverty, I'll say leave it. Affirmative action in education, I'll say keep it. It's important. Affirmative action to deal with issues of redistribution of wealth more equitably, I'll say why not? Let's look at it carefully. But affirmative action in business just doesn't work. Syed Hussein Alatas in 1970, when this idea was first touted, said it won't work. The wisdom of Syed Hussein Alatas. We are seeing it now, but they won't do away with it because it's too important a tool for political patronage. So I'll end on that note. My key concern. Yes, we can bring about change if we have the political will. These changes can be, as I said, be done immediately. But there is no political will for such reforms. There is absolutely no interest in devolving power to independent institutions. And therein lies the problem. Thank you.
Gentleman up there.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank Monash University for organizing this forum. Thanking the organizer also for doing a great job, and thank you, Professor, for coming over. My question is, my name is Josh Chu, I'm an accountant, and my question to Professor, do you agree that the forming of the GLCs in Malaysia is to keep UMNO in power?
I think we can take a round of questions, perhaps two more. Yes, Tan Sri.
Former bureaucrat.
I wasn't talking about you, right?
You can't be talking about me because we were a different kind of bureaucrat. John, don't you agree? But Professor, you have really thrown a lot of insight into very dark corners. And I hope your book will be read extensively and will help people in their voting for the elections. My question very short and simple, Anissa. Prof, all this started with affirmative action, the new economic policy, and one of the two prongs was restructuring society, restructuring capital, equity. Now with all these figures you have got, and with the great dominance of the GLCs, what is your own assessment as to the equity share by Bhumiputras? At one time they said 2%, of course it started that way, went up to 19%, I remember, and then after that there's been some silence. But I believe from what you have said that it exceeds 30% ownership and control. Thank you.
My name is Muhammad Dahan from Putrajaya, also a former bureaucrat. China is coming in a big way into the country. So, Professor, how will that affect whatever you have said just now? Thank you.
Okay, we'll just take one more question. The gentleman with the microphone there.
Hi, my name is Mr. Ho Yi Jian. I'm a freelance writer. When you talk about political will, I imagine that some of it must derive from the grassroots, right? But it does seem like, when you talk about like rural interest or like middle class interest, there hasn't, it's not been weaved into it. So I was wondering, like with this power shift into more centralization to the Minister of Finance Incorporated, would there be any impact on the rural and middle class? Will it shrink? Will it grow? What do you think is going to happen?
Okay, we'll allow Terence to answer these questions and then we'll take a second round.
The GLC to keep UMNO in power? No. In fact, every Prime Minister, Mahathir, Abdullah, Najib, talked about relinquishing the GLCs to the private sector. Mahathir talked about it, Najib stressed it, Abdullah said it, privatization many a time. The thing which I didn't mention here is this. When Najib came to power, he talked about the government being out of business and he said he's going to move into privatization in a big way. What Najib didn't realize was that he was sitting on a gold mine. The corporate structure that I showed you was a structure created by Mahathir, not by intent. It was a corporate structure that emerged because of circumstances. Mahathir was very keen on moving out these GLCs into the private sector. And he wanted to channel it to well-connected men. That meant that he could still control these companies even though they were now under private ownership. It was the 1997 crisis which led to the revamp, and here Noor Mohammad Yaqub is responsible for the revamp that we just saw. Abdullah comes in, and Abdullah talks about privatization, but recognizing it's not so simple to privatize, goes and revamps the whole thing in a very positive way. Najib inherited that. He inherited this structure with all this economic power centralized in MOF Inc. His initial reaction was, look, it's too much here, let's privatize. And then later realized, I'm sitting on something which I can use in a way in which can benefit the party too, or me in particular. And there is, I say this, allegations that he has done so. There are serious allegations that he has done so. So, were the GLCs created to keep UMNO in power? And by no means was that the case. Hardly. In fact, that's not reflected in the way policies have been articulated, even implemented. The second question by Councillor Raman Navaratnam on affirmative action is an important question. How much equity do the Bhumiputras own? My own estimate. If you look at the Malaysia plans, going back to the time when they first started, every Malaysia plan has got a table where they show the equity distribution along ethnic lines. So every 5 years we can see how equity ownership patterns have changed along ethnic lines. The last time it was presented was for the year 2008. If you go and look at the recent Malaysia plans, the table no longer is presented in the Malaysia plans. The government is now no longer telling us the equity distribution ownership pattern along ethnic lines. This raises an important question. Why is this the case? Najib, when he introduced the Bumiputra economic empowerment policy in 2013, said, Bumiputras now own 23% of corporate equity. The last figures that we have for 2008, the figure was 19%. And it had been at 19% for quite some time. I'm happy to see at least it's gone up to 23%, according to him. Only he knows, because it's not out there in the public domain. But before I go into the Bumiputra equity ownership issue, I want to say a few more things. Chinese equity ownership has been persistently falling. The peak was around 1990, 40%, it's been falling steadily. We don't know what Chinese equity ownership patterns are. The only ethnic group where we have seen a rise is actually, interestingly enough, Indians. From 1% in 1970, they have gone up to 1.6% in 2008. And even this 1.6%, and interestingly enough, when we looked at equity ownership patterns and we tried to do the ethnic breakdown, we saw that Indian ownership had gone up. But this is attributable to a few people. Tony Fernandez, Yana Lingam, Westport, then this chap Nathan in construction. A few people. Extreme concentration of wealth even among the Indians. And the other group, which speaks to the third question on China. The group that appears to be rising steadily is foreign ownership of corporate equity. One of the biggest successes of the NEP was if foreigners owned 61% of corporate equity in 1971. By the end of the NEP period in 1990, it was down to 22%. A 40 percentage point fall. Remarkable success. It has since then been steadily increasing. And at last count, in 2008, the figure was 34% in 2008. What is the figure today for foreign equity ownership of the corporate sector? So I call upon the government now, please tell us, give us the figures. What is the figures? Because why are you withholding the figures from us? Coming back to the issue of Bumiputra equity ownership, how much do you own? We can't tell. There was a time when Abdullah came to power, when he asked for feedback under an institution, ASLI in fact. ASLI commissioned a project paper, and we helped write that paper. We estimated that the figure was for about 50%. And that created a huge ruckus in Parliament. But the fact of the matter is, one important point came up in the debate. In that debate, they argued that the figure that we attributed to Bumiputras included the GLCs. The GLCs cannot be included with the Bumiputras anymore. The GLCs are Malaysian companies. They belong to all Malaysians. And that's why the figure then appreciably falls. I agree, fair enough. If you want to attribute these companies as Malaysian companies, fair enough. But still, give us the figures on Bumiputras. But here's the real exciting point now. I just showed you all, in my own figures, the falling away of the Bumiputra corporate elite. In my own figures for 2016, the only person who stands out now at number 42 is Syed Mukhtar. Of course, there are rich Malays, but I'm talking about corporate elites. I'm talking in terms of corporate ownership. What is happening to Bumiputras in business? I think the figures are worrying. But more importantly, what does it then say about affirmative action in business? It's a failed policy. And we persist with it. We have to ask why. Why do we persist with a failed policy, which even Najib at one point admitted it's not working? So this comes now to the point about China and China's rise. I'm worried about China's ascendancy in the corporate sector, but foreign direct investments are a key driver of growth. This is an export-led economy. The reason for Malaysia's rapid industrialization was driven by FDI. We can't run away from that. But it's the kind of sectors that China is going into that's worrying. Their control of the ports, you don't let foreign companies control the ports. Controlling utilities, telecommunications, it's now getting very serious. We have to look at these things very carefully. But that doesn't mean that all Chinese investments from China are necessarily bad. Political will, and what does it mean for the middle class and the rural areas? I won't talk much about the middle class because, frankly, the middle class can take care of themselves. I honestly feel that. We middle class, if our kids don't get good education in the public schools, what do? We send them to the private schools. If we're not happy here, what do? We go abroad, we work abroad. We can take care of ourselves. Thank you very much. I am worried about the rural sector. I am very worried about the rural sector. I'm very worried about education. I'm very worried about this concentration of wealth in terms of why isn't that concentration of wealth in the GLCs being used to help develop rural areas? The fact of the matter, the poorer states in our country today are Sabah, Kelantan, Terengganu, Kedah, Perlis. The first thing that stands out when we look at these 5 states is they're Bumiputra-dominated states. For all the talk about affirmative action and being for Bumiputras, why is it that the poorest states in the country are still the Bumiputra dominant states? What of development in these states? Why isn't development being channeled to these areas? Spatial inequalities are serious in this country. And the volume of assets situated in the office of the GLs, in the office of the MOF Inc. can be used to bring about a far more equitable development in these poor states. That should be the focus. How can we use our GLCs to bring about greater equity that will address the problems of the poor?
Terence, the older model presumed that there was a center of strategic intent and planning, which was EPU.
That's right.
But that has shifted away very clearly. And in fact, there are books written, I can't remember the name of the author, it's called The Rise and Death of Strategic Planning. It's recorded worldwide that this idea that there is some strategic intent sitting somewhere planning everything is humbug. Okay, given that reality, my question is this. What is the form of decentralization that would give some order and structure to apparent chaos? It's not chaos because somewhere between EPU and Pemandu and UMNO and MCA sits all the control of power. Somewhere in between those. But what can we think of as the way forward for the future between a federal control structure and localized controls? What I'm thinking of a two-structure model where the federal and local controls, So the locals are decentralized and controlled maybe by states or local authorities or whatever, and the federal remains federal. But what would your proposal be for the way forward? Thank you.
And I was intimately involved in the GLC transformation program. I found the lecture today to be very insightful. And I just wanted to perhaps ask Professor, your perspective in terms of control, I thought was potentially sort of not addressing the other element, because we are talking about all these words which actually ends with C, which is companies. So companies is not just control, but also the ownership, and effectively their redistributive impact of successful companies and the ownership and the benefits of ownership. And perhaps the question that was being asked earlier about the equity ownership of the various racial groups is a very difficult question to answer, because personally I was looking at this myself at Khazanah, and we had the same problem. GLCs are not defined as Bumiputra, but if you look at the GLCs, majority of them actually typically are majority Bumiputra endowed. Endowed being the PNB unit trust schemes, exclusively Bumiputra participation. Co-op, given the government sort of employment of Bumiputras, majority Bumiputra. Excluding EPF, I think Tabung Haji again, majority Bumiputra. So my argument or my question, I suppose, is have we looked at the institutionalization of ownership through the GLCs and the dynamics of actually now the control of these GLCs? And this is really a relevant question, because I think there is, as we speak, and as you said at the front of your, the start of your lecture, we are at a very critical point. I think you absolutely correctly identified that the transformation happened under Pak last time, because he was looking to really change in terms of how the governance of this was done. But I think we are running a risk of actually the control being concentrated inadvertently, because it's now coming back to places like MOF Inc. And I think this is something that I just wanted to just get perhaps your perspectives on. Thank you.
I'd commend you on your network diagram of the 68,000 companies. really complicated web that you managed to paint. And then secondly, on the ownership control through various sub-companies that you also managed to discover, which is really, I commend you on that. To what extent can competition actually exist between these companies and in the market when there is such centralisation of ownership? And could that potentially be something that's impacting the Malaysian economy at the moment, which I hear every time I speak to a local is not going so well? Thank you.
Answers, but I just want to get your view and your comments on Najib's policies, especially the package of reforms that he launched in 2009 regarding economic liberalization. I think it was very focused on the foreign investment and how significant was it, and whether it has contributed to what you mentioned, you touched on just now, on the rise of the return of these foreign investment and ownership equities. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for all those interesting, even important questions. Keith Wan Chai's question on the Minister of Finance. If you give someone else the Ministry of Finance, you're giving so much power to someone else. That is precisely the reason why Mahathir took over the Minister of Finance. He was fed up. First, we had to deal with Anwar, and he felt that Anwar was using the Ministry of Finance for his own political purposes. Then he had a fallout with Dime, because Dime was trying, to his mind, use his involvement in the bank consolidation exercise, trying to empower himself financially. So enough is enough, I'm going to be the finance minister. He would argue, Mahathir would argue, he did it because when you let these people run the ministry, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. I will clean it up. I'm not sure that's exactly what he did. But that was a defining moment in Malaysian history. A minister of finance, prime minister taking over the Ministry of Finance, even we were shocked when we heard it. Nobody had even imagined that such a thing would happen, and it happened. But what is really shocking is how Abdullah, when he came to power, didn't give up the Ministry of Finance. Abdullah did not give up the Ministry of Finance, and here we got to go to the politics of it. Abdullah was not a powerful politician. Abdullah came up because Mahathir helped push him up. And Mahathir helped push him up right to the point of Deputy Prime Minister, precisely because he felt Abdullah was no threat to him. And he thought that he could even control Abdullah after Abdullah took power. Abdullah, as a Prime Minister who was not very powerful within the party, was not going to relinquish the Ministry of Finance. It was too important a goal for him. Too important. It was too dangerous for him to do that. And then we have now Najib. Najib was, of course, far more powerful than Abdullah as a politician. He had never been in the wilderness like Abdullah had been after the 1987 crisis. But I would think that Najib probably felt it was not wise of him to give up such a powerful ministry to another company, to another person. It was too important. So will we see a point in time where a prime minister will give up the Ministry of Finance now that it's become such an embedded thing in the system? No. That is why, as I said, we have to force it. We have to force this demand down on the prime minister. This doesn't happen. Who is going to check the Minister of Finance if not the Prime Minister? And if the Prime Minister is the Minister of Finance, then where is the check and balance even here in Cabinet? So that is not something as much as we can demand it, and I think we should demand it, that can have serious implications in terms of who becomes the next Minister of Finance. The second point on control and ownership. The old model, EPU, the old model, yes, that's true. In every country in the developmental state, they had a centralized model, in the sense that one unit was primarily responsible for doing the coordination. You see it in every country. Of course, in Japan, it was MITI. And Malaysia began to follow the model. But the real institution that was responsible for coordinating the public policies was, of course, EPU. Is this model outdated? I don't buy that argument, really. What I do think happened is that there was a decline in institutional capacity among bureaucrats to really think through and develop policies properly. That is because of the way in which we brought in people into the bureaucracy. If you look at these other countries, one of the first things you'll notice about the bureaucracy is that only the best minds get into the bureaucracy. Are you telling me in Malaysia only the best minds get into the bureaucracy? It's the last refuge. If you don't get a job, you go and join the bureaucracy. Otherwise, I'm joining the corporate sector. Yes, we can laugh here, but that is the tragedy for Malaysia. The tragedy for Malaysia is we take our best minds and we put them in these units and they think through how we coordinate these things. Have there been attempts to try and bring about greater coordination? Yes, Abdullah tried to do it, especially in his attempt to try and bring about better performance among SMEs. SMEs, let me remind you, are 99% of the corporate sector, 99%. He created one unit, he centralized everything, created a coordination unit for the SMEs, SME Corp, put everything under SME Corp, created a bank, SME Bank. The problem is that not that we have not done it, it's the problem of institutional capacity and the reforms that have to go into to bring about a really vibrant bureaucracy that can deliver these policies. I'm making the argument that we have had some very interesting policy recommendations, but they have not been instituted properly. If they institute these things properly, I think we can bring about these changes, and they have the capacity to do it with the presence of the GLCs to help implement these policies. But the goal, the objective should of course be for equitable development. This issue on competition. Yes, to tell you the truth, there was an attempt to get the GLCs to compete, go abroad. Nazir Razak in CIMB makes much of his point that he goes abroad and he's trying to compete. I told you all in my presentation there is a professional elite that is coming on board and they have taken management of the GLCs. Do they know how to compete? Yes. They have the capacity to compete. They know how to do it. They're business people. They're professionals. They're not entrepreneurial. They're more professional type management. But the point is, do they know business? Do they know the corporate sector? Do they know the global economy? Do they know how to fit into that economy? I do believe they can do it. Are they well educated? Yes. Can they compete if forced to compete? I would argue yes. Why not? And we have seen some trends of that sort. Khazanah spends most of its time going abroad. It doesn't just look locally because Khazanah feels that they have to go abroad too and use that investments and see how they can use it far more effectively. Are they competing with other sovereign wealth funds? Yes, definitely. They're not the only sovereign wealth fund in the world. So this competition going abroad, we do see it. They have the capacity to do it. In fact, as I told you, my own figures indicate that GLC seem to be doing quite well. But they can be a tool for abuse. The final question, Najib's policies, economic, I thought there were a lot of benefits in many of the recommendations that he made. But my concern here is this, and this comes also to the second question about ownership, the point made about the strong state benefits the institutionalization of the GLCs. As much as I talked about today, about Chinese business and Malay business and Bumiputra equity and so on and so forth. Frankly, I feel we have to stop this kind of racialized discourse. Enough is enough. The point of the matter here, especially when it comes to business, we are trapped in this racialized discourse because that's the way the government plans everything. Everything is put in racial terms to us, and we deal with it in racial terms. The fact of the matter is we have bypassed entrepreneurial capacity in this country, and even Bumiputras have been bypassed because they're not well connected. We have evidence of that. I did the studies on SMEs. I was surprised to see this. They just didn't have the connections. We have to tap into genuine entrepreneurial capacity. It is available, and if we tap into them and we channel the rents to them appropriately, they can be a basis for growth. If we start going back to talking again, Bumiputra, Chinese, Indians, others, whatever that is, then it's going to make life very difficult. And being entrepreneurial, having business capacity is not based on race. And this thing about equity ownership patterns along racial lines. This is why I said earlier we need a debate on affirmative action. But nobody wants to debate it. politicians don't want to debate it. I published a book called The New Economic Policy about social inequalities and horizontal inequalities and reforms. We targeted the book to come out in 2013, just before the election. We were very proud of it. Here's a book on the NEP. This is a policy that divides the nation. This is the policy that must be debated. I took it to the opposition, and they said, no, we don't want to debate this book. I said, why? We will lose the votes. I can tell you now from conversations I had with people in the Barisan Nasional, they told me the same thing. This election is about winning the Malay heartland. We don't want to debate the policy. And so we missed the boat. And to everyone, to my horror, and everyone, I mean every one of us who contributed to the book, soon after the election, we came up with a new Bumiputra economic empowerment policy. When we knew that was the problem. The public policies are being dictated along political lines, and political discourses are deeply racialized, and so you see now what is happening. What are the implications of this in terms of ownership? You said that I focused only on control. My focus was only on control because ownership doesn't mean anything. I've said that before in my lecture. The state is so powerful it can expropriate wealth at will. And here we are still talking ownership. I said in the lecture, Rashid Hussain. Rashid Hussain is Bumiputra. He lost control of RHB Bank, which he built because of a few political elites. And ownership matters along racial lines. So let me end here by saying this. I think we do need a major revamp of public policies, but we also need a major revamp of our political discourses and the manner in which we articulate those discourses. Public policies cannot be based along racial lines. Public policies, especially for business, I'm talking about business, have to be based on entrepreneurial capacity.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the lecture is over. Thank you for being a great audience. Terence, thank you.